Most of us who are fans of 1980s popular music are well acquainted with the story of the band Asia, including their rapid rise to fame in 1982 and into 1983, their subsequent decline in 1983 and 1984, and their all but fading from view in 1986. To give a brief summary for those who perhaps don't remember the story, Asia were a progressive rock supergroup, at least in name. The four members of the original band had great pedigrees coming from three of the classic progressive rock bands of the early and middle 1970s. Guitarist Steve Howe and keyboards player Jeff Downes had been members of Yes. Singer and bassist John Wetton had been with King Crimson, and subsequent to that was a founding member of the great late 1970s prog rock band UK. Finally, drummer Carl Palmer, of course, had been with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and enjoyed that band's great run from 1970 until about 1977. Progressive rock, by 1981, had fallen out of favor on the radio airwaves. Asia defied expectations in terms of what they put out on their very first record in March of 1982. The band embraced a progressive pop style where they leveraged their great talents as players, but kept their music radio-friendly. Three of the songs from Asia's first album, Heat of the Moment, Only Time Will Tell, and Soul Survivor, were hit singles as well as anchoring the album, and were accompanied by memorable music videos on the then new music television cable station, MTV. Asia's first album would be the number one album of 1982, selling over 10 million copies globally. The band followed up their debut album in mid-1983 with the album Alpha, which was also a platinum seller, peaking at number 6 on the Billboard charts. The band also, at this time, was tapped to be the subject of MTV's first global satellite broadcast of a concert, scheduled for December of 1983 at the Nippon Budokan Arena in Japan, a show titled as Asia in Asia. It appeared that this band could do no wrong, but by the fall of 1983, cracks began to appear in the armor. Shows began to be canceled over the course of the band's North American tour. The reason that was given at the time was that the band was canceling these shows due to poor ticket sales. But for a band that had 2 platinum albums out and had a profile on MTV in the manner they did, that seemed unlikely. Several weeks before the Asia in Asia show took place, it would be announced that John Wetton would not be fronting the band for the performance. Instead, the band would be led on stage by Carl Palmer's ex-bandmate from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Greg Lake, providing vocals and playing bass. The Asia in Asia show went off as planned, and Greg Lake played in all 4 shows with Asia on this trip to Japan. He quickly, however, stepped away from the band, and within about a month or so of the Asia in Asia shows, it was announced that John Wetton would be returning to play in the band again. That was followed very quickly by a second announcement that Steve Howe was no longer in Asia, and that Asia would be taking a brief hiatus. Asia's hiatus would go for over a year, when in 1985, it was announced that they had brought on a new guitar player, Crocus guitarist Mandy Meyer. Asia would release their third album, featuring Meyer on guitar, Astra. Astra was nowhere near the success of Asia's debut or of Alpha, and the band's record company, as a result, declined to fund a tour to support the album. The band began to fade from view at this point, with John Wetton ultimately leaving the band to be replaced by various vocalists. Jeff Downes would become the de facto leader of the band and carry it on going forward, and on occasion would be able to reunite the four original members for special occasion shows and for brief tours. But the band had, by 1986, lost its momentum and were never really the same again, certainly from the public's viewpoint. That's the short version of the story. This episode is going to cover the inside baseball of the story, the things that happened behind the scenes that caused Asia's rapid rise and their almost as rapid fall. Let's start by introducing the major players in the story. Of course, the members of Asia are stars in the story, but in particular, 3 members of the band have major roles as far as how the story played out. One, of course, is the singer John Wetton, along with guitarist Steve Howe, and the man who briefly replaced John Wetton in the band, Greg Lake. The band's management and record label executives also have key roles in the story. Brian Lane was Asia's manager. He had, prior to the launch of the band, been the long-term manager of Yes, and had briefly served as John Wetton's personal manager prior to the launch of Asia in 1981. In addition, 2 executives from Asia's label, Geffen Records, are part of the story. One is the label's owner and namesake, David Geffen, and the other is Geffen's head of artists and repertoire, A&R, John Kolodner. Finally, appearing in the story in a cameo role is the founder and chief of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun. Ertegun was familiar with all of the players in the story. Ertegun's label, Atlantic Records, distributed the music of Yes, King Crimson, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer in North America throughout the 70s. During that time also, John Kolodner had been a long-term employee at Atlantic, and Ahmet Ertegun had worked very closely with David Geffen as well. Ertegun in particular gave David Geffen his first opportunity as a record executive when David Geffen launched his Asylum Records label in 1971, and was also instrumental in helping David Geffen as Geffen merged the Asylum label into Elektra Records in 1973, assisting with making that label into a full-fledged major as part of the Warner Music Group. While Asia formed in 1981, our story really dates back to 1974. In 1974, following the breakup of King Crimson, John Wetton briefly joined King Crimson's label mates, Roxy Music, on a short tour supporting their album Country Life. On this tour, Wetton became very friendly with Roxy Music's keyboards player, Eddie Jobson, and especially friendly with Roxy's guitar player, Phil Manzanera. He also became acquainted and maintained a relationship following the tour with an executive of Atlantic's artist and repertoire staff, John Kolodner. Kolodner was very impressed with John Wetton's stage presence and with his singing voice, and encouraged John Wetton to seek the spotlight to become a star in his own right. His words at the time were, "You shouldn't be looking to spend your career staring at Brian Ferry's backside playing bass. You should be out front." John Wetton took John Kalodner's advice to heart. He did not stay with Roxy Music beyond the 1974 tour. He would move on to a succession of bands, and then the band UK with Eddie Jobson. But throughout this period, Wetton's eyes were always, if you will, on the prize. He wanted to become a star, and the encouragement from Kalodner planted the seed in his mind to where he was going to do whatever it took for him to achieve success. By 1980, UK's existence had ended. John Wetton had made, in the wake of UK's breakup, a solo album, Caught in the Crossfire, which did not do well, and more to the point, was not even released initially in the United States. Wetton felt that the best way to go forward from here was to sever ties with his record label and managers at EG Records, and to go a different direction. Wetton's wife, Jill Briggs, was at the time employed by Brian Lane, who was very well known for his work as Yes's manager. And Lane agreed to take Wetton on as a client with the idea that he would look for opportunities either as a solo artist or as a member of a group for Wetton to front. Also in this time period, through Brian Lane, John Wetton reestablished connection with John Kalodner. Kalodner by this time had moved from Atlantic Records to the Geffen Records label. David Geffen in 1980 had started his new label, which was at that time distributed worldwide by Warner Brothers. By late 1980, it looked as if, through Brian Lane's and David Geffen's efforts, that a band had been assembled for Wetton to work with. This initial band included another client of Brian Lane's, Rick Wakeman, along with Carl Palmer and the then unknown guitar player Trevor Rabin. This band came very close to signing with Geffen, but ultimately Rick Wakeman would pull out at the last minute, scotching those plans. Wetton would take a brief side trip, appearing on an album with the British prog band Wishbone Ash. The album numbered The Brave. But by early 1981, Lane had identified a new option to take Wetton forward. By 1981, Lane's clients, Yes, had broken up, which made guitar player Steve Howe and keyboards player Jeff Downes available for a new project. Howe and Downes were paired with Wetton and with Carl Palmer, and the band Asia, in its initial incarnation, was born. The band would gel quickly. John Wetton had been assembling various song ideas throughout the last several years since the waning days of UK for a project that he had in mind that could hopefully take him to the next level. It was his thinking that the band could be progressive flavored, but could be styled as more of a radio-friendly pop band, not unlike the work of what, for example, Supertramp, Kansas, and Styx were doing at the time. To assist in that role, Wetton built up a strong partnership with Jeff Downes, who was a classical-trained keyboard player and was able to fill in the blanks of Wetton's song ideas. All of the members of Asia contributed songs to Asia's first album. But as luck would have it, the three songs that made the biggest splash on rock radio, Heat of the Moment, Only Time Will Tell, and Soul Survivor, were songs that were written by the pairing of Downes and Wetton, perhaps to the chagrin of Steve Howe in particular, who had envisioned a larger role for himself in this new band. Howe had been a major contributor to the songs of Yes over the years, and I'm sure saw himself as continuing in a similar role in Asia. Although he did contribute to 4 songs on the album, as I said, those were not the songs that got the attention. And that was something of a critical factor, at least in my opinion, as we'll see. Asia would release its first album, their debut, in March of 1982. The album was distinguished by the three great singles that I just mentioned, and it was also supported in a very big way by music videos. Phil Manzanera, with whom John Wetton had maintained a firm friendship going back to his days with Roxy Music, was a good friend of Kevin Godley, who at the time was working with his partner, Lal Cream, in producing music videos. And Godley and Cream would produce the various videos in support of Asia's debut. Those videos, in turn, got a significant amount of exposure on MTV, a music channel which was a joint venture between Warner Brothers, who distributed Geffen Records, and the American Express Company. So everything was aligned for Asia to be successful with their first album. And indeed they were. They got tremendous radio airplay. The album would fairly quickly rise to number 1 on the Billboard charts, and as I said at the top of the episode, was a huge seller across the year 1982 and into 1983, moving over 10 million units worldwide. None of the members of the band had seen this type of success on an album before, least of all John Wetton, who had seen some fairly strong success with King Crimson and to a lesser extent with UK, but not to the point where he was playing major arenas so quickly with a band as he had here. By early 1983, Geffen Records was keen for a follow-up to Asia's first album, and Asia began working on songs for what would become their second album, Alpha, first writing the songs and then recording them at Les Studios in Quebec. The direction that the band received for the second album was that since the songs from the first album that were most successful came from the pens of Wetton and Downes, that Wetton and Downes should be completely responsible for writing the music for Alpha. Steve Howe can't have been very happy with this decision, to be sure. The songs for Alpha, from the admission of all the members of the band, were not as strong as those from the first album. The concept of a sophomore jinx is always prevalent for new bands in the music industry, and even for these seasoned veterans in Asia, it was no exception here. They were looking to develop new songs fairly quickly. The fact that they were working in Quebec, which was new territory and a new studio for all of them, has been cited as a contributing factor to perhaps some of the music on the album being a bit lackluster. In an attempt to get the music a bit stronger after the fact, the band employed an outside engineer to do a remix of the album before ultimately committing it to vinyl and to CD. But the band apparently were not particularly happy even with the remix, but nevertheless elected to go forward anyway. Alpha was a success upon its release in July of 1983, but it wasn't a success to the same degree as Asia's debut was. It did sell about 2 million copies, but there's a big difference between 2 million copies and 10 million copies. That said, however, Asia were big stars on MTV. In concert with the release of the Alpha album in the summer of 1983, John Wetton was invited to go onto MTV for a special show where he was a guest VJ hosting his own video selections and also performing one song from the Alpha album, Wetton's The Smile Has Left Your Eyes, on acoustic guitar in an impromptu performance. At about the same time as John Wetton's VJ appearance, it was announced that Asia would be the subject of MTV's first ever worldwide satellite broadcast of a rock and roll show. Asia and Asia, scheduled to take place at the Nippon Budokan Arena on December 6th, 1983. The Asia and Asia show was actually one of 3 that would take place at the Budokan, along with a 4th show also scheduled in Japan in Osaka. In the time frame of the late 1970s and early 80s, A rock band's getting booked at the Budokan was a big deal. This was a trend that had begun in late 1978 by Cheap Trick with their Cheap Trick at Budokan album. It was continued by various other bands, including Bob Dylan, and it was a sign that the band had certainly arrived. And the venue was one where it was almost guaranteed that a band of Asia's stature would do very, very well. The band had arrived in a big way. Unfortunately, by this point, trouble began to brew in Paradise. As I mentioned, John Wetton had not experienced this level of fame or success before in his career. Wetton had a reputation from his work with previous bands as being a heavy drinker on the road, and was also known to make use of cocaine prior to performances as well. Wetton's drinking and drug use ultimately caught up with him during his 1983 tour with Asia. Steve Howe and Carl Palmer, apparently both in this time frame, took Wetton aside to encourage him to calm things down a bit, citing that his performances were becoming less and less reliable, that he was making more mistakes on stage in playing than were acceptable, that he was missing cues on his vocals. Wetton promised that things would improve. Apparently, however, they did not. It was apparently decided that the way to deal with the situation with Wetton was to cancel some shows and give him some time to recover. Exactly how this decision was made is unclear. There's really no documentation I can find on this. But if I had to make a guess, I would say that the situation around Wetton's drinking and drug use was escalated by one or more members of the band, probably by Steve Howe, to Brian Lane, who in turn shared the situation with John Kolodner and with David Geffen. I'm guessing that Howe was likely the person who escalated this because of his long history with Brian Lane, and because Howe and Brian Lane were both very much business-minded. I'm sure that their view of the world here was that the band was a business, that it was a cash cow that needed to be preserved, and that if Wetton's behavior was going to impact the band's viability as a business, that it had to be dealt with. So as a result, various shows on the band's North American tour in late 1983 were canceled, ostensibly because of poor ticket sales. People in the business probably saw through this. Wetton's drinking and drug use had not been a secret, as I said, although in the 1980s time frame, it's likely that for a band that was as successful as Asia, that these indiscretions were ignored unless they impacted the band's ability to perform, which, as I said, was viewed by the band as a factor here. The band was able to control the situation as far as their North American tour was concerned. However, there was the Asia in Asia show to deal with as well. Asia in Asia was being underwritten by MTV, which was owned jointly by Warner Brothers and by American Express at this time. Warner Brothers, of course, were the distributors of Geffen Records, their label. So there was really no hiding from Warner's as far as the Asia in Asia show was concerned. This is a show that had to go on. When it became clear that Wetton was not going to be able to deliver that performance, a plan B had to be found. And the decision was made to enlist the services of Carl Palmer's ex-bandmate from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the bassist and vocalist Greg Lake. Greg Lake apparently was asked by Carl Palmer and by David Geffen to step into the breach to cover John Wetton for the Asia in Asia show only a few weeks before the show was to actually take place. And his initial reply was that he would not do the show, that he didn't feel there was enough time to be able to do the performance justice. I would dare say, however, that in refusing the opportunity at first, that there was more going on in the mind of Greg Lake. Greg Lake and John Wetton had always been rivals on the prog rock music scene. They had actually grown up together in the same town, in Bournemouth, in the UK, and were acquainted with one another. Both of them had, of course, worked in the band King Crimson with another Bournemouth native, Robert Fripp. Greg Lake was King Crimson's original bassist and vocalist, and he had been of the opinion when King Crimson initially broke up in 1969, following the departures of Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles from the band, that King Crimson at that point should cease its existence, and in particular, Lake wanted that he and Robert Fripp start a brand new band with the two of them jointly at the helm, instead of trying to continue the King Crimson legacy. Robert Fripp thought otherwise. He felt that after the success of King Crimson's first album, that King Crimson was now established on a global basis as a brand, and that it made business sense for that brand to continue. As a result of this, Lake would move on to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, where he would start a new brand of his own. But Lake always was frustrated that Fripp had not heeded his advice to end King Crimson at that time, and would famously make comments to the press during King Crimson's existence, which included, of course, the time frame that John Wetton was fronting the band, saying that this version of the band was illegitimate, that they weren't any good, and that really the only version of King Crimson that mattered was that first one. So all of that to say, Greg Lake probably found it a bit ironic and irritating that a band fronted by John Wetton, who he probably viewed as something of an upstart, was outpacing the success that he had had not only with the original King Crimson, but with Emerson, Lake and Palmer as well. Despite his misgivings, though, Greg Lake was available to do the work. Lake had originally planned that he'd be spending the latter part of 1983 touring in his own right. He had, in particular, completed in mid-1983 his second solo album, Maneuvers, which in style was not terribly unlike Asia's debut in forging a progressive pop-styled approach. Maneuvers, however, did not do particularly well in the marketplace, and Lake's label, Chrysalis Records, severed ties with him as a result. With Chrysalis releasing Greg Lake from his contract, there was no tour to support Maneuvers, and Greg Lake broke up his band as a result. It's a shame, actually, because that was a very, very good band of musicians, including the great guitar player Gary Moore, along with two ex-members of the great touring outfit, the sensational Alex Harvey Band, the drummer Ted McKenna, and keyboards player Tommy Eyre. Given that he was available to take on the Asia project, Lake ultimately agreed. Lake's comment after the fact was that David Geffen had waved so much money at him to ask him to do Asia in Asia that it would not have made sense for him to refuse. To his credit, Lake worked hard to get ready for the show, and Lake put on a fine, if somewhat workmanlike performance. Some of the songs needed to be adapted for a lower key to accommodate Lake's voice. Other songs were of a nature where Lake very obviously was reading the lyrics on the stage from a teleprompter, something which was not as frequently done in 1983 as is done by touring bands today. The reviews that critics gave for the Asia in Asia performance tended to note these issues in speaking to Lake's performance, but nevertheless were complimentary as a whole. They thought that Asia had put on a very good, very professional show, and that it was well received by the viewing public both in person at the Budokan as well as worldwide. The show was a very well-rated show for MTV at the time. Greg Lake would play 4 shows in all with Asia in Japan. And based on comments that Lake would make some years later in his autobiography, was approached either by the band or by the label, possibly both, about joining the band full-time. In general, it appeared that the band enjoyed working with Lake, at least on this limited basis. Steve Howe went on record as saying that he would have appreciated the idea of moving forward with Lake and the band at the time. Jeff Downes apparently got along well with Lake as well. In fact, some years later, Downes and Lake would work together, albeit briefly, on a prog rock project that was titled Ride the Tiger, which sadly did not result in any significant recorded output. Greg Lake, however, claims that he refused this opportunity when presented, saying that he was not interested in playing the quote-unquote corporate rock that was required here. I question personally whether there really was an offer on the table for Lake. Carl Palmer has said in interviews around the subject that the only offer that was made to Lake was to play the shows in Japan. And I would be willing to bet that even if an offer had been made to Lake, that it was contingent on Lake's continuing to present the existing Asia catalog as part of the band's shows. Indeed, with 2 platinum albums under the band's belt, I can't see David Geffen or John Kolodner agreeing to bring Lake on without his agreeing to that condition. And Lake almost certainly would not have agreed to that. Greg Lake was a singer in his own right. He was very in tune to business opportunities as well, having been, the producer of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's records over the years in particular. And I'm sure that he would have wanted to pursue a gig with Asia only if he had had the opportunity to phase out the songs that John Wetton had written over time with songs that he had written himself or in partnership with other members of the band, so that he could recoup the royalties from those efforts. In any event, Greg Lake did not continue with the band. And in fact, there may not have been an opportunity for him there anyway. The issue that the band, their management, and Geffen Records had to deal with was John Wetton. John Wetton had, by the time of the Asia in Asia show, been all but fired from the band. But that announcement had not been made to the general public. All the public knew was that Wetton was not doing the Asia in Asia show. It had not been announced why. So the public did not know whether Wetton was ill and recovering, if he had left the band of his own accord, or if he had been fired. This would be public soon enough. In fact, it would become public on the night of the Asia in Asia show on December 6th, 1983. The manner in which it became public was through a documentary that MTV had prepared to be aired along with the show itself, a documentary called The Making of Asia in Asia. In order to make the documentary, in the weeks prior to the show, MTV had sent interviewers to the homes of the various members of the band. Not knowing that John Wetton was not going to appear, an interviewer actually appeared at Wetton's home, where Wetton politely informed the interviewer that he probably shouldn't be interviewed because he wasn't going to be appearing at the show. The other members of the band, of course, were interviewed for the show, and in particular, the interview that took place with Jeff Downes was a telling one. In the course of this interview, although he was careful about how he chose his words, Downes made it clear that Wetton's not playing at Asia in Asia was not Wetton's own choice. His words were along the lines of, "It hurts that John is not here because he was my songwriting partner, but we made a decision that had to be made." Reading between the lines, it was clear to everyone who saw this episode that John Wetton had been fired from Asia. I can't imagine that the news being broken to a worldwide audience in this manner went down well with John Wetton at all, and it was certainly considered as news within the music community. Not long after the Asia in Asia show took place, John Wetton and his wife Jill received a telephone call from the head of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, Ertegun knew all the players here on both the management team and in the band very well. And Ertegun used his knowledge of the players here perhaps to an unfair advantage. He was very complimentary to John and to Jill, giving them confidence and saying, "You'll get through this, this is fine, it's a shame that things have happened this way." But then he added the tagline at the end of the conversation, telling Wetton that if he didn't think that things were going to move forward with Asia given these circumstances, to let him know, and that Ertegun would contact David Geffen to buy out his contract so that Wetton could pursue a solo career at Atlantic. John Wetton now had an ace in the hole as far as negotiation was concerned. Before long, John Wetton would receive a second phone call, this one from David Geffen, saying that they needed to have a conversation and that he felt the right thing to do under the circumstances would be for Wetton to return. One wonders whether Ahmet Ertegun had contacted Geffen here and given him something of a heads up saying, "You better move quickly to secure this man's services, because if you do not, I will." Jill Briggs, in fact, makes this suggestion outright in an interview that she did for the book that was released in 2023 to celebrate John Wetton's life, called An Extraordinary Life. Geffen would provide John and Jill Wetton with 2 tickets on the Concorde to travel from Britain to Los Angeles to discuss the matter further. Prior to getting to LA, however, John and Jill would receive a third phone call, this one from David Geffen's ex-partner, Elliot Roberts. Prior to launching Asylum Records in 1971, Geffen and Roberts had run an artist management agency which focused on various of the artists based in the Laurel Canyon area of Los Angeles, where their most notable clients, of course, were Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Roberts made a point of telling John and Jill to, before meeting with David Geffen, to meet with him first, that he could offer some coaching on how to read David Geffen and how to get what they needed. But he apparently had spoken with Ertegun as well. His tagline was the same. "Given the bitterness and the frustration here, John, if I were you, I would take Ahmed up on his offer and go to Atlantic. Don't bother with these guys anymore." John Wetton would indeed go for a meeting with David Geffen, which I suspect was also, at least in part, attended by Brian Lane and perhaps by members of the band as well. But he did not take the advice of Elliot Roberts or of Ahmet Ertegun. He agreed to return to Asia. Now you might ask, why, under these circumstances, would Wetton have agreed to return? He obviously was in a situation here that was, at best, uncomfortable. Why deal with that? My suspicion here is that Wetton felt it was the best approach because at this point, to use the words that I attributed earlier to Robert Fripp, that Asia was an established brand. Asia had made 2 platinum albums, largely under John Wetton's leadership, with his voice and his bass playing and his songcraft being major pieces of that success. It probably was only natural in Wetton's eyes to want to build on that if it was possible. And so it was announced about a month or so following the Asia in Asia show that John Wetton was returning to duty. About 2 weeks later, it was announced that Steve Howe would be leaving the band. Howe has made notes in his autobiography, as well as in the interview that he granted for An Extraordinary Life, that the first couple of weeks following Wetton's return to the band were amicable, and that the band had made good progress on how to move forward. But that at that point, a band meeting was held where Steve Howe was informed that the band had made the decision to move forward without him in their ranks, and he would depart at that point. Apparently, however, John Wetton wasn't ready in full to return to duty at that juncture. He still needed to do some drying out as far as his situation with alcohol was concerned. Jill Briggs has gone on record as saying that John Wetton's drinking during the time of their marriage was never as heavy as it was during this period of uncertainty in John's career. And it would be over a year before Asia would at last regroup with a new guitar player. I suspect that one of the things that John Wetton might have been hoping for here was that he could bring his friend Phil Manzanera on to play guitar with Asia. Around the time that Asia had completed their Alpha album in mid-1983, Roxy Music had broken up following their North American tour in support of what would be their final studio album, Avalon. And I'm sure that Wetton had it in mind, following this, that he might be able to work with his good friend Phil Manzanera. That did not, however, come to pass, at least not immediately. Phil Manzanera made the decision to move his career forward in what would be a short live band with his Roxy Music bandmate, Andy Mackay, a band called The Explorers. Wetton would ultimately, following the release of Asia's third album with Mandy Meyer, Astra, pursue a project with Phil Manzanera using songs that were apparently candidates, or would have been candidates anyway, for a fourth Asia album at that time. However, by that time, the relationships between John Wetton, his manager Brian Lane, and David Geffen began to sour, and the album that Wetton and Manzanera made together was not well supported by Geffen Records. There may have been, according to some accounts, an attempt by Atlantic Records to buy Wetton's contract with Geffen out at this time, but that David Geffen deliberately refused to give Ahmet Ertegun this album so that he could bury it and spite John Wetton for whatever slight Wetton might have committed against him at this time. Asia pretty much would fade from view as far as being a force on the music scene after the Wetton Manzanera album failed in the marketplace in 1987. And as I mentioned, Jeff Downes has, in various forms, kept the band afloat since. Most recently, Downes has been pursuing an Asia tour largely to commemorate John Wetton's memory, with assistance from a new group of bandmates, including the ex-It Bites guitar player John Mitchell, drummer Virgil Donati, and bassist and singer Harry Whitley. This version of the band has been touring on and off since late 2023 and is apparently now scheduled to release an album sometime within the next year as I make this video. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Jeff Downes has done a wonderful job over the years of curating the Asia brand and enlisting new band members who are respectful and who love this music, who can deliver it to audiences who love it as well. But sadly, the original version of Asia did not meet the type of end that one would have hoped for. This was a band that, as I said, for the first year and a half or so of its existence, had done a remarkable job of delivering music to the public that was exactly right for the public at that point in time. It is a shame that it couldn't have gone on just a little bit longer. Anyway, that is all for this episode. I appreciate your being here as always. If you have any comments you'd like to share, of course, please feel free to leave those, and I'll do my best to respond when I can. If you liked the episode, by all means, please let us know that as well. And if you're not yet a subscriber to Propaganda, of course, please join us as we go forward in the weeks to come. Thank you again, as always. You take good care. Bye-bye.